I would like to introduce our debaters, keynote debaters, Professor Imanol Ordorika from Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico, and also visiting professor in the University of Johannesburg, and Professor Brian Passer from the University of Virginia, Charlottesville. So the idea is that I will ask them a couple of questions. They will try to answer, or they will answer them. And then if you have any comments on that, please raise your hand, and they will try to comment on that and answer that. Okay? Okay. All is clear? Okay, the first question is that you both have argued that the scholarly approach to understanding the politics of higher education is flawed. Can you discuss why that is, and if the field did better understand the politics of higher education, what would be different for scholars, practitioners, and institutions?
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, Jussi. I'm going to go first on this one. Thank you for bringing us here, and Daru for your work in organizing this, and everyone for being here also. Jussi has a whole series of cards here that say 1 minute, 5 minutes, 3 minutes. He's like a soccer referee. He has a yellow card and a red card. So I'm going to tell you the conclusion before I walk through the time that I have. And then Imanol will tell me what I did wrong. So fundamentally, to the question about why I feel the approach to politics of education is flawed, is twofold, really. One, a historical story about the way in which the field of higher education developed as a scholarly field. And the other is, for a very long time, the lack in many parts of the world of a critical scholarship of higher education. So those two pieces together, I think, begin to explain the dearth of truly political approaches to higher education. So higher education as a field, I think, as we know it, is about maybe 50 years old. So it's not particularly old as this goes on. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, higher education grew out of other disciplines. And fundamentally, from its origin, it drew on sociology, looking at people like Weber and Blau, and then later, of course, Burton Clark and a whole school of sociologists. And in a very prominent way, it also grew out of the study of organizations. So you have people like Cohen and March and Weick and Pfeffer and Solanchek, who were very influential in the 70s and early 80s. We borrowed rational choice, economics, Adam Smith through Gary Becker, and most importantly, for what we'll talk about a little later in the questions, people like Hayek and later Milton Friedman, who have been very, very influential in the development of the field. And then there's also a kind of a scholarship of students and student affairs, which is very powerfully shaped by psychology and industrial organizational psychology. And fundamentally in that story, there's not much political science. And many of the people who have practiced political science in higher education were not themselves political scientists. So I don't mean this as a critique of economics or sociology or psychology or organizations. They're all very useful, but they don't lead to that kind of fundamental model of politics that you might find in the field of political science and in some other areas of scholarship. It's also the case that the political science that came to higher education was a particular form of political science. So in the early 1960s in political science, there's a schism. And one area of the field goes into thinking about things like agency theory and models of the executive and political action and so forth. People like Skronik and Kingdon, agenda control scholars and that sort of thing. The other branch of political science went into what we think of today as public administration. And so that's people like Selznick and Lindblom, who are really thinking more about institutional function and systemic institutional function. So in the combination with organization studies, we get a kind of a politics of functional institutions. And we don't get a politics of power or interest groups or political authority. We get isomorphism and iron cages, and we get the sociology of organizations, but not really the political theory of either institutions of higher education or systems of higher education. And by that I mean really state theory. When I talk about political theory, we're talking about state theory, approaches to power, thinking about contest in the sort of Gramscian sense. So there's some exceptions to how this unfolds. Some interesting critical work from people like John Mayer and Paulo Freire on the marginalization from the state, and a very strong feminist and then later critical race theory and theoretical approaches. Nancy Fraser and Foucault and Bourdieu and Derrida, all of have had huge influence on critical scholarship in higher education, but not particularly political scholarship. It's really in the late 1970s and early 80s in elementary secondary education where people like Martin Carnoy and Hank Levin and Bowles and Gintis, Giroux, Michael Apple, they really begin critical political studies or critical studies of education. But it's not really until another decade or so when people like Sheila Slaughter, Gary Rhodes, Cynthia Hardy, Imanol, others come and begin to bring the state back in the sort of Scotch pole sense. So let me just say a couple things about what we would understand differently if from the beginning we had a stronger approach to politics. I think we would have been much better positioned to understand the rise of markets in higher education from a political perspective, as opposed to the sort of classic rational choice economic perspective. The scholarly approach to markets was very slow in building in higher education. Slaughter's work, Simon Marginson's early work on markets in education doesn't come out really until the late 1990s. Which is long after the rise of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and others. And we were seeing the effects of neoliberalism on institutions long before, as a field, we had a strong scholarly understanding and response to that. I think that it's also the case that we would have been alerted to what I would call today a kind of a growing crisis of human capital theory. So from the economic wing of the study of higher education, it's founded essentially in human capital theory. And it's the foundation of policy arguments for higher education and for education everywhere and all the time, both for individual returns on social mobility, but the sort of collective community returns to human capital. But today we see a stagnation of wages for college-educated people in many parts of the world. We have an international crisis of student loan debt in which students are not accepting going forward the idea that this investment is worthy of the level of debt that they're carrying, and that the relationship between the state, their debt, and their economic and educational futures are not accepted and understood in the classic theorems of human capital theory. And I think it's a big issue that, again, lacking that strong political frame, we've been very, very, very slow in coming to that. And I think we were also slow to come to international and comparative political work. Had we earlier had a stronger sense, certainly in the United States, had we had a stronger sense of state theory and the way to apply that, we would have had a better international comparative approach to the politics of higher education. And particularly, so much of our focus has been on institutions, institutional function, institutional life, institutions in their national context. And that's really that public administration history, that's the organization's history. It lacks the nuance of higher education institutions as sites of contest, as instruments in broader contest. It doesn't situate them as political institutions in the way that I think we would have if we had a stronger sense of the political narrative from the start of the field of higher education. So maybe I'll pause there and let you take over.
Wow. What a summary. 12 years ago, there was a meeting here in Jyväskylä, a CHER meeting, and I was invited as a keynote speaker to try to convince the audience that universities were among the most important political institutions in society. Maurice Kogan, by the way, was sitting like 2 rows into the crowd, and he was the owner of the Political Perspective, as you might recall. He published in the 1987 book, 8 Perspectives on Higher Education, edited by Burton Clark, a chapter called The Political Perspective. And Kogan's political perspective was nowhere close to politics, in my view. And I was younger, dressed up in a Fin Air T-shirt, because my luggage didn't arrive, as it didn't arrive this time, but now I have Juicy's shirt. My argument there was that, especially in the context of what was called, and is still called, the knowledge society, universities that had historically been a site of political struggle for nation building and economic development, were so amazingly political and still always depicted and described as non-political institutions. And instead of arguing it from a theoretical perspective, let us think a little bit about the presentation we just saw, with the particularities and very interesting views about Jyväskylä University. This is the opening presentation of any administrator all over the world in their universities, in our universities. And this is a lovely city and a beautiful campus. I used to say, this is how the world used to look like before humans destroyed it. And it must be great to be here. But still, we can't forget that our world, if we open the newspapers, is populated by poverty, inequality, violence, migration, a crisis of international and national political institutions. And we have nothing there to say about it in regards to our universities. We are geared towards knowledge development and towards having a good campus life and to be very inclusive and to bring people from all over the place. But we always seem to be so capable in our institutions to just shut down the real problems of the world away from our auditoriums and our classrooms and our meeting places. And I think that's the original flaw, if we could call it that, like the original sin or the original accumulation of capital. We can use Marx or the Catholic Church or the Christian, whatever. But there is something out there in the way in which we have internalized our understanding of universities and higher education, that we always maintain the political part away. So only when we are faced with issues of access, in my country, like 91% of the students that demand access to public higher education institutions are thrown away, and they have to go to these horrible garage privates if they can make it. No, we have sometimes we discuss the issue of financing, and we have talked about the public funding becoming less and how we have been privatizing our institutions, but it has been in some ways a marginal debate or discussion in higher education. And instead of that, we talk about high tuition, high aid models, or we talk about the ways in which, the last time I came here, Nokia could share a building with the university and really develop a lot of exchange, even financial exchange, and bring a lot of funding for the institution. And much less we have discussed the uses of knowledge. These are 3 aspects of political contestation, permanent aspects of political contestation. Not all of the projects, research projects that we put forward are funded. Many times you go out on a limb if you are trying to address issues of narco-violence and higher education institutions in Latin America or many other places, by the way. No? So we have been very successful at criticizing the ivory tower while maintaining ourselves within the ivory tower. And this has impacted theory, of course. So suddenly, some crazy wacko from somewhere else comes and says, oh, no, no, no. This is an absolutely political institution. Decisions are being made all the time that are essentially political. And we are connected to some economic development models, not even projects, broader models. We are connected to a discourse of economization of societal life at every level. We do cost-benefit analysis for buying novels. No? Should I really benefit from buying this or this other one? We have bought into this new public philosophy that philosophers were talking about in the late 1980s with the coming of Thatcher and Reagan that Brian was mentioning. And we have totally bought into the idea that we can think about the world in economic terms, and that economics is really the most serious and formal of the social sciences, and that we can do positive political theory based on economic models and rational models and all of this stuff. But we have left out of the picture, basically, that the universities are defined by power. They are established with a mission, and it was much more in the open, probably in the early days. It was either the church or the crown putting together universities, at least in my part of the world, and they fulfilled two purposes. One was to expand the Catholic religion in the Americas. America is not the United States. America is a whole continent. And the second was to build local elites in order to fulfill colonial projects. That was the purpose of the university. What are the purposes of the universities now? Are they really geared into the idea of giving people fine campus experiences? Is it this the motive why so many states in the world provide funding? Maybe less than before, but still a vast amount of funding to institutions. And the core argument here is that universities, as other levels of education, are sites of political struggle, where there are tensions between the idea of expanding access versus the meritocratic idea of selection of students. There are competitions or contests or political battles for what should be studied and debated and what should be kept away from universities. There are discussions about resources, not only if we get them from the government or not, if we have to increase tuition. That's a big political debate almost everywhere in the world, and obviously of political mobilization, but also of resource allocation within institutions. And there are maybe some political struggles within the bureaucracy, within the collegial organizations, until maybe presidential elections comes about in Spain or in South America, or some of the universities where there actually are elections, not in the US universities or most of the Anglo-Saxon world. So I think that to try to close this first round, politics is all about relations of forces. Forces for what? What are we going to try to build a coalition for? And I think that even not only the theoretical understanding of universities, but the alternative political agenda vis-a-vis the established political agenda that sometimes we cannot even figure out, has to be discussed in terms of these issues of access, the uses of knowledge, and resource allocation. And coalition building and political force building, which defines politics in the end, has to be built with ideas, programs, and a very strong awareness about constituencies and social groups that might be willing to be connected to the university. And in that sense, we have also made a lot of headway in isolating ourselves from the public, from the rest of the world outside of our universities. A lot of people don't give a damn about what we do here. And there's kind of a schizophrenic discourse where people value our universities and still do not have any connection to our universities. So I think this is, in a very broad sense, the scenario in which we try to build up theory and a political understanding of an institution that most of the time appears as non-political, and in many, many cases, even government authorities or university authorities or even faculty argue in favor of the university not being a political institution and saying that politics is something pathological within higher education. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do you have any comments or something to debate, Georg?
Well, many thanks, Georg Kassel. Many thanks for both of these inputs. I have a comment on Brian's uptake on the role of the political in higher education. So first of all, I fully agree with what you say with the role of disciplines as a necessity to link higher education research to disciplinary research, and that maybe political sciences did not play the role that it should have played. I'm wondering, though, about your broader claim that the discussion about state and market is simply not there. And I think maybe in the US is the case, but I think in Europe it is not the case. Because in Europe, since about 2 decades, we have a very vivid, comparative, theoretically oriented, empirical, methodologically found debate on governance. And governance mechanisms obviously include the state and the market. It has a strong comparative aspect. We will have an entire session on that in the afternoon. And I was wondering, obviously it's the state and the market, but it's obviously also the community. It's competition, which for me is analytically distinct from the market as governance mechanism. And we have a whole debate on the creation of markets in economic sociology. People like this are trying to bring that into higher education research. And my question is rather, because I'm doing that kind of research too, and here I see a huge cleavage between Europe and the United States, because here, with all my kind of US orientation, I don't find a US-American counterpart. And my question is, why is this the case? Why is, and my guess is maybe it has become so institutionalized, so much taken for granted that maybe in the United States these things are no longer discussed. But I think in Europe we have a current vivid discussion on market creation, higher education, and so on. And maybe you can reflect on this difference between the US-American debate and the European debate. Thank you. Yeah.
No, it's a really good point. I don't disagree with you. I think 2 decades is it's also the case there's a much stronger theory of the state in the US for the last couple of decades, right? So Sheila Slaughter writes Academic Capitalism with Larry Leslie in 1997. It's, you know, it's having its 20th anniversary now. But I think if we go back to the origin of the field 50 years ago, I don't think it's so different in Europe than it is in the United States. The other point I would make, too, is it is not abundantly clear to me, and you all can help me in the audience, that the study of governance of higher education globally is this study of the state. It may be in some cases, but it is not uniformly the study of states, theories, power, politics, and context. The study of governance globally is leadership, organizations, systems, network theory, you know, some political sociology, but we can discuss in some more detail. I just want to say one other quick thing, if I can, about one of the problems with the origin, I think, certainly in the US and maybe to a lesser degree in Latin America and in Europe. One reason we have the politics of higher education has been so bereft in the United States that we can't even account for the political support that higher education had originally. The support for higher education in the political sense, certainly in the United States, is beyond the ken of most scholars and people in the institutions. I'll give you a quick example which is poignant for me because I come from Charlottesville. You know a lot about the gun laws in the United States. And there are basically three kinds of gun laws in the United States. There are states that don't allow people to carry assault rifles and guns openly. There are states that allow anyone to carry assault rifles openly. And there have been many, many states that allowed universities to make their own decision about whether or not they were going to allow people to carry guns on campuses. This is a huge political deal. This is an incredible political fight in the United States. The idea that you would give any institution the right to say you can't have a gun here is enormous political power. And over the last decade or so, those laws have been contested and been changing. So as you saw at the University of Virginia, people were carrying assault rifles openly across the campus with their hateful signs and slogans and chants, which was not the case, would not be the case, except for the shift in the political climate that took away the space for universities in Virginia and in many parts of the United States to control whether or not people could bring weapons across their own campuses. We had more political power before than now, and virtually no one in my university could explain to you where it went, how it happened, what forces. They would say, oh, National Rifle Association. But the political dynamics, that special space that the university has occupied historically is politically, it has a political origin and politically mediated. And we have been so separate from that political scholarship and contest that we don't even know our own political powers eroding and don't know the origin of those powers.
Any other comments, questions? Imanol, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I'd like to say that I agree with Brian that talking about governance and nowadays governability is a way of depriving these understandings of university organization and ruling from all its political content. It becomes very technical. In the 1970s, we were debating about the state. Was it a pluralistic state? Was it a common interest state? We were debating pulanzas and the notion of and Althusser of state apparatuses and institutions. Are universities state apparatuses? Are they state institutions? Have we abandoned all the discussion about what is the connection between the university and the state? Because we thought that globalization, we didn't think. Globalization brought a trend of the notion that the state was withering. It was disappearing virtually, and nothing of that has happened. The state has strengthened itself. It has become leaner, but it has become much more incisive in terms of establishing a lot of policies, economic policies amongst them. And still, now we don't connect our universities with the state, except for arguments about steering at a distance and stuff like that. No, what is the ideological and political purpose of an institution in a class society? We have even abandoned these concepts. Should we use some different ones in these heavily stratified socioeconomic status societies that we have nowadays, so that we don't use bad words because people become uncomfortable when we talk about class? So we're not talking about the state and the university anymore. We're talking about government and the university, and we're talking about government in the university. And we're talking, when we talk about governability, that has become one of the major topics today in the allegedly more or less political understanding of higher education institutions, we're talking about techniques in order to become legitimate, more or less participative, and stable governments within institutions. But just to show how disconnected we are from, as universities all over the world, from state and international issues, is the fact that last year, a lot of things happened all over the world, and we were totally unaware. So the vote about Brexit came by, and all the polls said that it was not going to pass, and our universities were very comfortable arguing, no, this is not a major issue, it's not going to pass, and it passed. And then everybody was saying, and the universities were not deeply committed to preventing Trump from getting the nomination of the Republican Party. It was not going to happen. And then it happened. But he was not going to become a president, and he became the president. And the universities still, the day after the elections, we had the opening meeting of the ASH conference in the United States, and people were in awe at 9 in the morning. I had to deliver the speech. I changed it completely. What happened here? We never thought this could happen. We were going to talk about public goods. No? And the world was changing as it changed so intensively. In Colombia, there was a negotiation between a 50-year-old guerrilla group called the FARC and the government, and they established a peace agreement, and it was put out on a referendum, and everybody thought it was going to pass, and it didn't pass. And the universities were totally out of it. They didn't play a role in campaigning in favor of it. There was no debate about it in the universities. Totally unaware, totally uncommitted, totally separated from the political process. Brazil. The universities were challenged by the government in the midst of this like legal coup d'etat against an elected president, Dilma Rousseff, and the coming in government issued a statement saying that public universities were not allowed to debate the issue of the removal of the president. The federal universities had to go to the Supreme Court in order to open a debate that had never happened. It was only when they were told that they couldn't debate that the universities started saying, oh, we have something to say about this. At least we should be able to debate about it. So are there more issues? What about Barcelona? What about 30,000 missing people in Mexico? Lots of, how do you call them, unknown graves full of unknown people, no, killings all over the place. And what about the expanding conflict between the Arab world and the rest of the world, in spite of a 16-year-old occupation in Afghanistan? That is debating the connections between the state and the university at the broad and at the local level. No? Take an understanding of what the world looks like, how it is expressed through institutions, and how universities connect to that. We did that in the 70s. We forgot all about it. I'm not saying that we have to recycle the same arguments and theories that were about in the 70s, but we have to develop something of that magnitude in order to understand where we are sitting. Otherwise, we can discuss a lot about financing, about how much of the private sector comes into the university. Even, I have even criticized Brian, and it's very difficult to criticize Sheila because we love her so much, but say, well, you know, I think it's limited in this understanding of the state because you really don't go with path dependency to really challenge state theory. But we're not there, and at least we have to be clear on what we're lacking in order to fill that void that needs to be developed today.
Okay, Hugo.
Hello, my name is Agosto from the University of Hong Kong. I might have very naive perspectives on this, but I would like to have your input on two things. To what extent what you're saying, and I have to say I totally agree with what you're saying, but I wonder to what extent this relates to the training that we're having and that we're giving to our own graduate students. We have policy, we have politics. Let's simply be in the comfort zone and be on the policy side. Also, we became very good at analyzing what's going on, but we became really terrible at proposing something else. I mean, in my university, what was it? 3 months ago, we had quite a prominent scholar coming there to talk about Newman generalism, so on and so forth. He did a wonderful keynote, but at the end, we were like, okay, so what? So what is the alternative to this? And the answer was, well, it's not up to me to really propose alternatives. So what are we doing then? I mean, okay, we already know. We're saying the same thing over and over. These things are bad. These things are happening. What is the alternative? And this, I think, relates a lot to the training that we're having, that we had, and that we're providing to our students. A second idea on this is, how does this relate to careers? Because the thing is, if we're doing this, it's because we are in a comfort zone or because we really stretch to already a huge limit in terms of time constraints and what careers demand of us. We do research, we do teaching, we do service. If now we engage in this more political component, what about our family life? What about our personal time? I mean, we can't do everything. So either this gets in somehow into our careers and our careers change at universities, or things are not going to happen. And I'm saying this from a territory where the government forced people in. And the first one, the member of the guy that is now ruling the council, the first thing he said was, you guys at the Faculty of Hong Kong are all a bunch of lazy people, and stop writing articles for newspapers and start doing your job. And your job is not giving opinions that can influence the public opinion. It's to do research, it's to do teaching. That is what you're there for. So how to deal with this? This is what I really like to hear from you guys. Thank you so much.
Hugo, and before we go to that, I think that Don has a question, but then I think we will need to go forward here. Don. So who is using power now?
I'm getting a green light now, thanks. I'd like to give the green light also to our discussants. I mean, it's a great way of opening a conference. 2 remarks and a question, if I may. First, about higher education and its role in the state. We shouldn't overestimate ourselves. If we talk about political debates about education, usually it's about what the Americans call K-12, primary and secondary education. Universities, mwah. Not politically interesting. Perhaps because parliamentarians or politicians don't think that you can get many votes there. Which is strange because students are the ones who can start voting and primary and secondary school children can't. At the same time, higher education has become very much instrumentalized in the governmental debates. The ivory tower could be allowed to exist in the times when higher education was an elite thing and it was really small enough to benefit from benign neglect. Nowadays it's instrumentalized for, let's say, workforce planning, good old communism in effect, gaining all over the world even though we call it neoliberalism. What do you think about that, this type of paradoxical development? And then in reaction to what Imanol was saying about our role as universities as a critical element in the society, is that a role for the university as a whole? Should we ask our presidents, our rectors to do this, or is this an individual task? As Hugo Horta was just saying, I mean, what are we doing with our time? How are we teaching our own students? What are we doing with our own pieces for the newspapers, which we're not allowed to write anymore, at least not they in Hong Kong. So is this an individual role of the intellectual, or is it really an institutional role?
Well, excellent questions. Could you give short comments?
Yeah.
I know this is
You're looking at him when you say that, right?
I've never made a short comment in my life.
We're clear. Just so we're clear on that. Let me make a very short reply to Hugo, and then Ima maybe can tie some of this in. So I'm very sympathetic to what you have laid out. I think it mirrors the experience that many of us have in universities around the world. With regard to graduate training and so forth, you can't train people with tools that you don't use yourself. And I think one of the things we probably should have said at the outset also is, we're doing what we always do here, which is we're talking about higher education like it's one thing, and we're talking about the faculty like it's one thing. And frankly, there is a lot of action research, a lot of research translating into practice. And I would say right now much more effectively, if you will, politically on the right than on the left. So we were at Stanford together. There's a very powerful Hoover institution. I'm close to Washington, D.C. today. You have things like Brookings and Cato and American Enterprise Institute, and they are loaded with faculty. And they have people moving in and out of academia and into the policy arena. And many of the things we've talked about, the rise of neoliberalism, the shrinking of the state, and so forth, is very powerfully driven by academics and academic ideas. There's funding there for that and so forth. So people are getting it done. People are getting, and there's very, very good critical and action research on, coming from different perspectives, from different models, political action, particularly driven by students. Again, a lot of the energy there is coming from there. And just quickly to Don's point, the universities are moving much more to the center, I think, of some of these political debates now. I think the competition globally around economic development, tech transfer, innovation, and so forth. You're absolutely right. Traditionally, the political battle has been about elementary, secondary, certainly in the United States. But I think clearly the attention to sort of high value added education is pushing the political debate further and further to even professional education, higher education, and so forth.
Well, I think that we have historical evidence in the 1960s of how universities changed the world. There can be no argument against the idea that students from within the universities, but not only students, the universities themselves challenged the state of things. And they brought, or they strengthened an alternative popular culture, and they strengthened ideas about gender equality and about the environment and about democracy and about the war in Vietnam or Algeria. And so the universities have been there before. I'm not saying that we have to be there in the same fashion. And I'm not saying that this is a matter of voluntarism. Hugo, I think that we're training in some ways in the direction where our own students, we are being pushed both by the administrations and the students. And that's where our agency comes about, where we can try to bring something into the table that might be different. But I am also sensing, and this was going to be my closing argument, I don't know if I should put it in there now, that we are living in a context of the collapse of political institutions in many countries in the world, as has been seen by some of the examples that I put forward. I could put many more of them forward. And this collapse of political institutions are putting universities in very uncomfortable positions. Trump is putting the universities in the US in a very uncomfortable situation. So either you can have the administrations trying to float around and not commit in any direction, or you can start defining yourselves. And when the white supremacists come to campus, you have to position the university in one direction or another. And it's starting to happen. I just think that I'm going to talk more about it if there's a chance, that we should be ready for that and thinking about that in order to make it happen from within, not wait until we're in a very, very anguished and difficult situation.
Yeah, Pedro, did you have a comment? Yeah, short one, please. Yeah.
Thank you, and thank you very much. Okay, can you hear me? Yes. Okay, good morning. Thank you so much for sort of very stimulating start of our conference. Just a few very quick comments or questions or provocations, I hope. The first one is, I think at a certain point we were starting to have what I thought was very much a macro discussion of the political dimension of universities. And in some ways, I like very much some of the subsequent comments because I think they derived our attention more to the micro political dimension of universities. And maybe I'm biased because of the fact in recent years I have institutional responsibilities. And one of the first lessons I think I learned was how much of the personal issues explain institutional decisions. And there are other people here, I think, that also have responsibilities, and I think probably they would share this view. Because you start questioning, why do we have these things organized this way? And say, oh, because this person has a problem with that person, or because that person is very influential, and so on and so forth. So, but sort of on a more elaborate way, I mean, Imanol, you raised the issue about competition and power battles inside institutions. And being an economist, I tend to regard a lot of what is in institutions as a space for competition for resources between individuals, between groups, between disciplines. And I think this has been, to a large extent, disregarded by our research. I think we tend to focus very much in terms of the grand discussion about the political dimension of universities, but much less about the internal politics in universities, which has, in some ways, a sort of more noble dimension about different views of what an institution is about, but has also less noble ones. And I think that these are also explain a lot of institutional and organizational dynamics. And just as an example, I mean, we talk very much about the public mission of universities, but we talk far less about the public mission of individual academics. And I think very often what we have is a sort of ex post reconstruction of what we've done vis-a-vis a certain principles or certain missions, where we try to make some cogent argument about what people have been doing, when in fact it's actually a sum of very individual or group strategies. The other aspect that I think that would be interesting is that we talk very often in terms of system-level policies, of the impact of funding changes, quality assessment, internationalization, but we don't discuss so much how uneven the impact of these changes can be inside institutions. I mean, as you were saying, in terms of at a broader social level, internationalization, globalization is an opportunity for some people, but it's certainly a challenge for others. And this is, I think, also the case within universities. You can have age gaps where for some people it's too late to catch up with some of the trends. You can have disciplinary differences as well, but the same could be applied to research and research assessment, to the ways that quality assessment is perceived and implemented, and so on and so forth. Yeah, and the other, just speaking and on the last minute I have, picking on the issue also in terms of careers. And a lot of the discourse that we've been having in higher education in recent years tends to promote what Hugo was highlighting, which is safe careers, effective careers. And I don't think that much of that relates to a lot of what we've been discussing in terms of the mission of university. It tends to place an enormous stress in terms of individual returns, and not so much in terms of social returns. And I think that also links to the complacency that Imanol was alluding to, I think.
So let me just say something quickly. There's a lot of, that's a wonderful comment. But to that competition of resources and the mission of the university, those are driven by external forces. The competition for resources, at least in elite research universities, is state funding. In the United States, National Institutes for Health, National Science Foundation, foundations are driving the research agenda in universities, not the other way around. And so that competition for resources that we're seeing is directly linked to the political legitimacy of various forms of research and funding. And to your point, I don't disagree at all that the mission is increasingly that people are looking for sort of safe careers, but that's because foundations and national funders are pushing them in safe directions. And that's where the resources come from. And this is only going to accelerate. This is going to get worse before it gets better. So I think all the instincts are right, but that essentially this is always, I think, an intermingling of external political pressures, internal alignment structures and political pressures. It's not one or the other. But certainly in the United States, increasingly, the institutional life is driven by external funding. Universities generate very little funding. There isn't any funding in a university other than philanthropy. We could argue that in a public university in the US that doesn't come from some kind of external mandate or charter for the rate of tuition or the sources of research funding. And that is essentially and inherently a political process.
Well, Amy, did you have a comment or?
Amy Metcalf from the University of British Columbia in Canada. Friends, I do not think you are pushing yourselves far enough. I think you aren't being critical. I think you're being critical-ist. You're being like-critical, metacritical. I know both of you have a lot more in you. One of the things that Imanol very casually, quietly slipped in there was the concept of colonialism and the history of our institutions, but as a historical object and not as a conditional presence, that we are continuously being colonial in our activities. And in many ways, that is a political act. It's a political act of a particular type. We may not see it within a state framework. It's a supranational framework of imperialism, new imperialisms. So I think we could continue to speak about that as a politics. And Imanol also, when speaking about the conditions of 1968, students were protesting the university itself for those very same histories and complicities. So it's not so much to say that in the 60s the institutions themselves were critical. It's that people within the institutions, not all of them, some of them, were calling into question and calling those institutions to host a different set of conversations with different bodies and different peoples with different outcomes. And Brian, in working with you on the book, looking at critical perspectives on higher education, I don't know if you remember this, but you asked me, do you really want to use a particular word in my chapter? And that word was genocide. And I said, yes, we need to speak these words. And your concern was very collegial and trying to protect me as a researcher from people's perception of what I'm saying about my use of that word. But we need to do that. We need to use these words. We need to say we are supporting in this field, to many extent, a colonial, imperialist, genocidal, organizational, and institutional space. So please continue.
Thank you.
Well, let me tackle several of the things that have been said. I'll start with you, Amy. I do think there's a new colonialism, and it's a model colonialism. The notion of the elite research university model from the United States is a new colonial project that is, amongst others, is imposed upon all of our universities. We all have to be measured with a kind of a Harvard-ometer, which is a ranking of any type that says how much your university is fulfilling the role of our RU1 private university in the United States. That's a new colonial project, and we have adopted it fully. And we adopt it through our research journals. We adopt it everywhere in the ways in which we are performing our individual careers everywhere. And we're not challenging that at all. We're not even arguing that our universities might want, not even if they can fulfill that role or not, if we want them to do that, or should they focus in a totally different thing. I don't think that the 60s were about essentially challenging the institutions. It was the Vietnam War. It was civil rights in the United States. It was against the authoritarian political regime in Mexico and Czechoslovakia and Hungary. It was against the dictatorship in Spain. And it was maybe in a few places, or some of the issues were local, maybe free speech. But what about the loyalty oath that the faculty stopped adopting in the United States in the 1960s and challenging McCarthyism as a whole? So faculty have done that, and they didn't stop publishing or writing sociology or biochemistry papers. They came out in the open and challenged a state of things that was unacceptable at the time. If we look elsewhere, we can see the streets in Buenos Aires full of hard science researchers and teachers and faculty in the streets challenging the government because there is no funding for science. And the people are out there, and they are, at the same time, they are demanding that marijuana be legalized. And this is a really strange coalition, no? And it makes sense. These are people that are well informed. So I do think that the times, they are changing, I would say, and not necessarily in our favor. Somebody mentioned, I think it was Juicy before, that once there are alternative facts, and that the most powerful government in Earth can argue that everything that we do in our institutions is a biased fact that they can challenge just by political discourse. We have been thoroughly challenged. And the politically correct discourse that stemmed essentially from universities and university thinkers and intellectuals within universities, like gender equality and anti-racism and human and civil rights and stuff like that, has been challenged from the toppest level of power. And it's happening in other countries too. Well, the Le Pen challenge in Paris came relatively close. So that's a very, very strong political discourse. Are we going to say anything about that? Do we have anything to do? That's the way in which colonialism is expressed in each country. There is no colonial layer that is exactly the same everywhere. In South Africa, students were bringing down the last Rhodes statues within campuses last year or the year before that. And university authorities were not sure. In some places they were in favor of the students. In others they were like, what do we do now? And the ANC, well, they had disappointed everybody around, so we don't know exactly what the position was. But basically, we are seeing a lot of local and international political processes that are putting the universities in the crosshairs, really. And this is it's going beyond funding. It's challenging the nature of higher education itself. And in the vast majority of the world, it's not Finland. When Jussi went to Puerto Rico a few years ago and put forward the problems of higher ed in Finland, everybody said from Latin America, we want those problems. Can we have them here? And well, most of the students never get to higher education in Latin America. No? And that is increasing, not the reverse. So we are on the verge of a big political, and I'm doing a little bit of what, maybe looking at the magic ball or something. I do think that we are facing strong political battles in society, and the universities are necessarily in the center of that, independent of our careers and our willingness to be a participant of that. But we, in some ways, those who became the strongest part or who promoted the movements in other times, because it was not only the 60s, where the people that were prepared for that were discussing the issues that had to be brought to the front and were able to generate the alternative ideas that we had to put forward. And yes, well, very simple alternative ideas like universal enrollments and others like that can be brought to the forum. And, but we're lacking in that direction. I agree with you, Hugo.
Well,
So,
I think I want to give Brian a chance this time.
He's spoken all of the time.
Introduce a new question.
I'm exercising power now.
Good.
Yeah, so I think that what we have been discussing so far is somehow related to the role of higher education in civil society. And also to the ways of the social role of higher education in societies and in states. And I would like to change the focus a bit to what actually Imanol was speaking in his last note. On the inequalities and inequalities of and around higher education. So my question to you would be, From a political and theoretical perspective, is higher education part of the problem of social and economic inequality in national and global context, or a force for reducing inequality?
Okay, in the time-honored tradition, I would say both. At the outset.
Thank you.
But I'll say a little bit more. And I say both because this is really where we confront that problem of talking about higher education in monolithic terms, right? So this is very contextual, depending on whether we're talking about an emerging higher education system, whether we're talking about a very old and established system or an old system with a few very powerful institutions, like in a place like Chile. And the degree to which people are able to access higher education and the degree to which higher education in different contexts is linked to reducing inequality is very different in different places. So let me just talk a little bit conceptually by using the United States as an example. And clearly I would say the United States is not doing nearly enough to reduce inequality. And this is happening on two levels. It's happening very distinctly in the ways in which income distributions track levels of education and pardon me, educational success. But I think also it's happening in the ways in which we're training people in higher education to think about inequality, to go back out into the broader society and to address in the civil society and in other ways the problem of inequality. So many people know the higher education system in the United States is probably the best funded system overall in the world, a very powerful and diverse system of higher education. But let's look a little bit about what's happening with inequality in the US and with higher education. So between 1975 and 2010, if you think about that, that's like 35 years. Maybe you can think of that almost as 2 generations. Family income in the United States increased by an average of about 40% over those 35 years. And in that same period, family income for the poorest 1/3 of American families and children actually declined. For a 35-year period, the average income of those families declined. Children who were in the top 5% of families in terms of income saw their income double over the same 35 years from 1975 to 2010. And children in the, and again, a child in the US born to parents in the lowest income quintile has about a 43% of chance of becoming an adult with income in the lowest income quintile, right? So if you imagine a kind of random walk through income quintiles, in any income quintile, about 20% of the people ought to be in a given quintile. But it turns out that if you're in the lowest income quintile, the chances are very good that you're going to stay in that lowest income quintile throughout your life. The chances of you starting in the lowest income quintile in the United States and reaching the highest income quintile over your lifetime is about 4%. So basically, this is not social mobility in the sense that we like to talk about it and think about it. But a child born into a family in the highest quintile has about a 40% chance, have about double the chance that you would predict of staying in that highest quintile. And practically no one falls out. So if you're born in the highest income quintile in the United States, your chances of landing in the bottom quintile over your lifetime are somewhere around 6 or 7%. It's not going to happen. A highly stratified system, which is not entirely due to higher education, of course. But higher education is a big part of that story. So let's just take a minute and think about graduation rates. Okay, if we think about college graduation rates for people who were born between 1961 and 1964, and then compare them to people born between 1979 and 1982. So you have 2 different cohorts, again, roughly 2 generations. The graduation rate for those in the lowest income quintile increased 4% from one generation to the next, right? So it hardly changed at all. For those born in the highest income quintile, the graduation rate increased by 20%. Right? So over those 20 years, we've done a much better job of graduating wealthy people and done almost nothing to increase the graduation rates of people who are in that lowest income quintile. But when children from the lowest income quintiles or young people from the lowest income groups in the United States do get college degrees, they tend to advance pretty quickly in the income quintiles. So there's an effect in higher education, but we haven't done a very good job of getting people access and success in those particular institutions. And the degree to which people graduate and complete higher education is distinctly related to income and wealth to a rather astonishing degree. And around the world, high income inequality is associated with low social mobility. And the United States, Brazil, Chile, Peru, they're places with very low social mobility. Denmark, Finland, Canada, they have low income inequality and they have high social mobility. So although institutions of higher education don't fully control the preparation of people who come to try to access higher education, we could do a lot more than we're doing now, I think, to prepare people for college education and moving into higher ranks of the society, professions, and income. But this is really also shaped by what happens within the institutions around curriculum, around mentoring, around civic engagement, around a sense of collective action. But not enough, apparently, in higher education or in our education system to change the approach to inequality in the United States. We're not teaching people to address the problem and make changes through the civil society or the political system. And the system itself in place is credentialing and educating people in ways that is increasing inequality, moving the best prepared and best educated away from the least prepared and least educated. And it's actually accelerating as we speak. We can talk a little bit more about what it would look like around the globe if we had a more strongly enforced right to a good education. What it would mean if there was something like a right to a good education that could be enforced globally. There's no such right in the United States, incidentally. You don't have a right to a higher education. And I think that it gets into a conversation we might have a little bit later about the public interest or the public good. But fundamentally, without some kind of rights-based claim, this is going to require action in the civil society and political society that right now just isn't there. So as we speak in the United States, the higher education system is increasing inequality. It's not reducing inequality.
Well, I agree that it is both, and but I would approach it, I don't disagree with Brian, I would approach it from a different perspective. It has been argued strongly from different perspectives, Bourdieu and Althusser on the other side, that education at every level is always reproducing the stratified nature of society. There, Don, is where I don't necessarily agree with you that universities are uninteresting for the political systems. Probably not about numbers, but they are very strongly linked to the meritocracy of explaining social stratification in places where there is a more or less broad higher education enrollment. I'd say that against the deterministic view that Bourdieu put forward at one point, there's the idea that precisely that is one of the issues for political contestation. And it goes in a very basic direction, once again, about access. It can be the highest funded system in the world, but it only enrolls 40% of the age group. Many countries are above that, even in Latin America, not Mexico, by the way. That doesn't necessarily mean that there's equality in access immediately. And the notion that, that was put forward by the California Master Plan by CHER in the 70s, and later by Burton Clark in this diversification of institutions agenda all over the world, that was, I don't know, maybe Burton Clark just rationalized what the World Bank and other international agencies were pushing or driving for, this stratification between universities and vocational institutions and other types of higher education, where it's obvious that students do not have access to the same levels of income and socioeconomic status if you come from one institution or the other. So basically what Simon Marginson's work on universalization, it's interesting that we call universal enrollment systems those that are more or less around 60% of enrollment. Would that work for basic elementary education if we said, oh, we have a universal system, we only enroll 60%? Of course it doesn't work, and it's only 100 years ago that universal enrollment for elementary education was put forward. I do think that we have to move towards an agenda of true universal enrollment in a much more homogeneous setting of institutions in different countries. Obviously, that is a big, big, big political battle. And it comes surrounded with a lot of issues of how the contemporary society is built and how inequality is explained. But because, well, we all know this discourse about how our performance in the educational system essentially explains how well we're doing in society. And that gives a lot of leverage and legitimacy to social systems. It has been doing it for ages. So I do think that instead of saying that universities are basically driving inequality, I'd say that it depends on the state of the political battles at the time. In moments in which social groups in society are capable of expanding enrollments and of attaining more homogeneous, the access to more homogeneous institutions in terms of quality and opportunity, then universities can perform a role exactly to overcome or to diminish inequality. As we are right now, in the state that universities in most of the world are right now, essentially we are not only reproducing but increasing inequality everywhere. That would be my response to your question, Lucy.
Yeah. Okay. Any comments, questions? Yeah.
And I'm here on a Fulbright Finland grant, so I'm interested in studying global equity in Finland. And so I'm really interested in this conversation because also to Amy's point, I think that it's just not critical enough, because I don't think that you can talk about global equity without talking about international education and the way that many systems of higher education across the world are contributing to global inequity. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I probably haven't come across clearly enough. I'm not talking about global equity. I'm talking about equity, trying to address it from an international, bringing cases from different places in the world. I don't think that there is global inequality between countries and within countries, and between regions and all of that. We all know that. But I'm trying to bring some cases forward just to show how inequality in education, in higher education, is expressed in different ways. For example, in the US, you have this 40% coverage where more or less 60% of enrollment is in community colleges and special focus institutions, not in the RU1s and the master's institutions and all of that. That's one type of inequality. When you don't have students, when you have like 8 million students between 18 and 24 years old that don't have no education at all and no jobs, that's a different type of inequality. So there's no global one, at least in my view. We can say that globally there is inequality, but it is expressed in very different ways. In the ways in which they are developed in our countries. And we need to have this broad international understanding, but we also have to be grounded in the realities of our systems everywhere, of our countries and even our regions. And even the types of institutions within our countries. Because sometimes, as we were saying before, we are a very privileged crowd. We come from the research universities from everywhere. But most of the faculty in the world don't even come to conferences like this. They're different. They live in a different world and talk about the student. That's a different setting and dialogue.
So it's interesting, I mean, we got this far without using the word legitimacy. I don't think we have yet.
I do.
And maybe. But to your point, which I think is a really, really important one, I'm sitting here, you know, if you were to think about the ebb and flow of this conversation, at times we argue that we're powerless, increasingly powerless, and other times we're powerful. And I think we have to take a stand on that. And I think that universities are enormously powerful because they're institutions of the state. And to Amy's point, they reflect the missions and values of the state, and we're not very comfortable with that. We simply don't want to confront the fact that as institutions of states that are attempting to dominate others, that are trying to impose a kind of hegemony globally, this is a very old story, universities play a very powerful role in that. They're centers of instantiating and reinforcing norms through scholarship and through the construction of discourse, through alliances with the political sector. That doesn't mean at the same time that they can't be forces for kinds of protest, contest, liberation. They're conflicted. They're contested in their own right. They're enormously complicated institutions, but I think it's important. There's enough romanticization of them to go around, and it's really important for us to call ourselves out. I don't think we can argue for state theory and suggest that political institutions of the state play an instrumentally important role, and then assume that somehow universities are not going to incorporate and reflect some of the primary missions of the state that are not aligned with social justice, that are not the kinds of things that we might advocate in some other setting or some other context. That's what we are.
Well, part of the reasons why I wanted to focus on inequality is that one of the promises of higher education when the massification of higher education started was the promise or assumption that when there will be more students in higher education, there will be more equality. So more equality and because of the increasing number of students. Simon Marchinson has edited with Brendan Cantwell and Anna Smoletseva a book on high participation systems where they argue, and our chapter is in there, that what has happened is really that instead of increasing equality, inequality has maintained. There has been a strong stratification of the systems, of the stratification of the higher education institutions, where the elite goes to the best universities and we rest go to those less good higher education institutions. The only exception to this annual rule seems to be Nordic region. And so this is my point is mainly that state intervention really matters. But what kind of state intervention? Do you have an opinion about that?
What kind of state integration?
Yeah.
Oh, I think that the state in itself, and there we go to state theory itself, and is a site of political contestation. This is an old debate. Is the state instrumental to capitalist accumulation? Is the state relatively autonomous? Is the state a site of contestation? I'd say that Gramsci has written a lot about this, and also Poulantzas did in the latter work, about the fact that there are certain state institutions in which this contestation is taking place. One of them is the political system. But what we're seeing is that the political system, as Bobbio has said, you can see that you have trouble in a political system when there is not much difference between the political parties that you're voting for. Yeah, it's not the same to vote for Hillary or for Trump. But in terms of state project itself and economic development, it's not such a big different story. Now, probably that's the most extreme case in all of the countries, but or in many of the countries. But what is the role of higher education in that condition? Are we only reproducing I don't think so. I think that we have been in a long stage of reproduction with this idea that the universities are connected to the knowledge economy and that we are producers of knowledge to be exchanged in the market. And one of the products of knowledge is graduates of higher education. It's for the job market. We have been doing that historically. That has been the role of institutions. But there is always sometimes it's a weak battle, in other times it's a stronger confrontation to establish at least some equilibrium between the creation of goods to be exchanged in the market and the creation of other type of knowledge and understandings of society, other type of value related to higher education, and to expand it to a broader set of the population. So I'd say that the confrontations that take place inside and around higher education are part of confrontations that are taking place in terms of trying to redirect nation states. And it's very difficult to think about it after 30 or 35 years of the end of history, where nothing seems to move and everything seems to be set on stone. And all the discourse of possible transformations and changes in society has been, in some ways, overwhelmed by the notions that the market and the economy have demonstrated that they define everything in society. Now, that is part of the intellectual challenges of universities, to try to develop new ways of thinking about transformations in a broader arena that goes outside of the university itself. But I do think that this is happening, and it's happening because we have all of these demographic changes, migrations that are shifting the political balance everywhere. We have all of these human rights crises everywhere. We have a very unstable international political condition that allows for at least to starting to think that things can be different in a broader sense than some of the battles that we have taken in the last years, where we are trying to establish small equality projects, community connections between universities and small local businesses or local communities and stuff like that, which was like kind of a small resistance space that we have taken. But we need to be thinking in a much broader scope in order to make these challenges to the state in general and to its institutions, and in particular to higher education.
So one quick comment on that. If we're going to talk about higher education as a product of contests between the state, the civil society, actors who are marginalized by both the state and the civil society, we're going to have to do more on inequality in the civil society, right? So differences in money is something we talk about all the time, and I talked about, but differences in political access, in access to discourse, gender inequalities, historical racism, any number of historical and contemporary structures and standpoints in the civil society that are in turn driving state policies in that contest, or at least attempting to drive state policies in that process. And the relationship between inequalities in the civil society and inequalities that are driven by state policy are very similar to conversations about inequality in higher education and the role of higher education institutions. To the point about, your point about Scandinavia, Nordic states, I would say that the attitude in the civil society towards collective action, towards shared institutions and responsibilities is different than in other contexts. It's reflected in all the institutions of these societies, and it's reflected in the state role. But no one of these is driving that or reflecting the other. Again, getting back to this idea that this is a contest. So to argue for a more robust and emancipatory higher education system probably argues the same has to happen in the civil society. And in another And another debate a few years from now, we could have the same structure where we'd be talking about the civil society in higher education and ask the same questions and march through where we stand and where we sit with regard to that.
Yeah. Just a very brief comment, because we don't need to think that everything is moving backwards or on the wrong direction. Just look at female enrollments almost everywhere in the world. There are some regions that are really in very difficult problems, but in a lot of countries, the female enrollments are above male enrollments now. And this is a change that has happened in 20 years. Now, feminist discourse has two explanations for this. One is that higher education has become uninteresting for males, and they are withering, or they are moving away from higher education. I don't think there is evidence to support that argument. I would think that one of the groups, or one of the social movements that almost all over the world has been pushing more strongly to attain certain levels of equality, especially in education, has been women. And there have been very important results, and these are conquests. These are things that have been gained and that had happened because there has been social action around it. And there are numbers to show it, which is something in favor, and that also shows that things can be done when there is social action and organization.
Thank you very much. Now I think that we are closing we are reaching the end of our session. We have been discussing about the higher education and the politics in higher education, in and around higher education from micro and macro perspectives, about academic careers, the role of higher education in society. So actually my question to you would be that do you think that academics should be politically active? And just to make it more serious, I would like to ask all of you who think that academics should be politically active to raise their hands. Thank you very much. This is a very personal but also academic question. Well, where are we committed to our careers, to our society, to our higher education institutions? I don't know that. I don't think that there are right or wrong answers, but I think that all of us need to have a personal relationship to the question. So I think that my colleagues and friends would have many things more to say, but I'm very sorry we have to stop now. But as a small token for what you have done to us today, we will give you something finished. We are living also in a pragmatic society, so I think that you may use that to carry all the political theory books that you must have. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.